Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeremy Goldberg, President Quarterback of LeaguApps. I've had the good pleasure of meeting many of you, and if I haven't met you, I know you've been joining us, many of you, for the town halls that we've had recently. So we're really excited to host this invitation-only Q&A with some of the most important youth and local sports organizations in the entire country. And some of you are folks that are really familiar with LeaguApps. Others are not, but have incredible reputations for the work that you're doing in communities. And so as a service to this community, as a service to this emerging industry, we really wanted to put today an intimate, private discussion and conversation to really get your perspective and questions on what's going on around financing opportunities for small businesses. And the hope is this is actually going to be a recurring series that we're going to host, these kind of intimate kind of Q&As on a range of different topics. I'll bring my own perspective as the president of LeaguApps and someone who's been an entrepreneur and thinking about how to navigate these times. And then we're really fortunate to have an incredible guest today that you could be excused for believing that he's part of the LSU coaching staff here when you look at Tom's background. And what I love about it is he loves sports, he loves impacting communities, and this is a gentleman who understands more than you could possibly imagine about accounting and taxation and the law. Based on his background that I'll describe in a second, that he'll bring to today's discussion. So I want to explain how this is going to work, and I have a confession to make. This is the first time that we've done this kind of formatted event. We're using Zoom, a webinar, which is a little bit different tool than we've used for these kind of webinars before. So I want to explain how this is going to work or what to expect. I'm going to get into this introduction of Tom and to help you understand why he's a guy that LeaguApps has counted on for a lot of our insights and understanding for a few years now. Then I wanted to kind of prompt by giving an overview of the situation. And then asking Tom a few questions off the bat to help frame the conversation. And then this is really your time. And so what we're going to ask of you is to ask questions. And there's two different ways you can do that. You'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. You can go ahead and click that and submit questions. And when you do, everybody else can see what those questions are. And if you like the questions that are in that panel, go ahead and give it an upvote. And then I can get a sense of some of the questions that people are most interested in. The alternative is you can also click a button that's somewhere, I'm told, on your screen about raising your hand. And when you raise your hand, someone on our team will identify you and then call on you, unmute you, and you'll have a chance to ask a question for Tom and I about the situation. So again, we want to make this a discussion and we want to make this as relevant as possible, and that requires a partnership here. So first, let me give you Tom's background, and then I'll explain how I'll frame today's discussion, knowing that so many of you of the organizations out there are really struggling, right? We know that you're going to bounce back. We know that youth sports and local sports are going to be played again. We know there's going to be a demand for this. So how do you survive to thrive this period? That's a theme that we've been talking about at LeaguApps at the next type of events that we've been doing. One of the key ways to do that is really navigate the opportunity around financing, especially tied to the CARES Act that just passed. Now, Tom is currently the managing director of Alvarez & Marsal, and the tax practice is based out of Houston. But he brings over 16 years of experience in accounting, consulting, focusing on things like research credits and incentives. And he understands how to work with small businesses to really capitalize on programs like this. And so he's someone that is in the weeds in understanding the CARES Act, how organizations should be applying, what they should be asking and understanding. And he's got a background initially beforehand as part of his own consulting firm. He's part of Arthur Andersen as well, where he managed audit and consulting engagement for Fortune 500 companies. So Tom, I just want to thank you for being here. I appreciate your sports fandom as well. Congrats on the LSU championship. You might be championships for multiple years, the way the world seems to be going now. But really appreciate it. And you are the Joe Burrow of tax and legal authorities right now for this group. So we're excited to have you here. So
Thank you, Jeremy.
By way of framing it for everybody, you know, each of you as an organization, we're facing this at LeaguApps. How are you managing this period where your revenue is dried up and you've got to manage your expenses? And you've got to figure out how to finance that period, right? And so there are a couple different options you have. There's the expense side, and we had some conversations about this last week, right? And Tom and I could talk about this if you have questions about what are the strategies to stretch out your account payables, right? You know, as an example, we could go to our landlord and have a conversation, which we've done, about the situation, what flexibility they might give if you're not in the office. What are the ways to collect more money, right? What are the money that's owed to you, and how do you have those conversations around collections? What are the ways to reduce other expenses that you have by thinking differently about contracts or by thinking differently about the way that you're spending money? And of course, there's the challenging questions about what you do with your team, whether it's layoffs, whether it's furloughs, whether it's shifting their kind of hours, and different strategies that you might use to make that happen. And that's the expense side. What we really
Yep.
wanted, though, to have the bulk of the conversation to talk about is, are there opportunities on the financing side, right? And people can certainly take investment capital. I can talk about my experience with that. You can talk about going out and accessing debt from other sources like banks. But there is a unique opportunity right now with the CARES Act that is literally designed to help organizations like yours at this very moment. And I wrote a blog post. If you haven't read it, it's blog.leaguapps.com. I'll ask Jamie to post that on the Slack, the chat tool here, so that you can actually see it. But what that was about was really saying, okay, what does the CARES Act mean for you as an organization, right? And so what I was going to do with Tom, just as a starting point, is to walk through some of those key aspects of it, so that we're all level setting about the key things that you need to know about what this act is about. Because what the government's basically saying is, we want to give you access to money so that you keep your team employed as much as possible, right? To keep payroll up, to give people jobs, to minimize the number of unemployment where 10 million losses have already happened, and to also help you manage the expenses you have in the organization. So the first thing to understand that is that there's financial assistance that are contained within it. And so one thing is the payroll protection loan. You'll hear these called as 7A loans. Tom, can you explain what is that? What is the 7A loan program? And I assume everyone here, and maybe Jamie could throw up a poll to tell us, are you guys already considering doing this? Because if everyone is all over this, we don't have to kind of review some of the basics. But in this case, are you planning on applying for this SBA loan right now? Would be a helpful thing for Tom and I to see. And I think Jamie will open up voting for that. So in this case, I'm curious, Tom, how do you describe what the 7A loan is about? How could that be helpful to these incredible youth and sport local organizations that need access to some capital right now?
All right. Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you again for the opportunity to talk today. So the best way to think about the 7A loan program is it's the federal government's primary response to assisting small companies during the coronavirus outbreak. Very early on, when the government was considering how to build stimulus programs to respond to coronavirus, there was a lot of concern that small companies would be left behind. There's a strong perception that with TARP and the other programs that were launched in the wake of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, that not enough was done for small companies. So the big picture idea from TARP, from PPP or 7A or however you want to term it, let's just call it 7A for right now. Big picture idea is to provide 8 weeks of funds to small companies to be able to cover payroll, rent, mortgage interest, and utilities. So essentially, if every small company had to shelter in place for a 2-month period, what would they need in terms of capital to at least keep those costs going and keep some lifeblood flowing through the economy, if you will? That's the best kind of general idea. Excuse me 1 second.
Right.
The next, kind of drilling a little bit deeper down into PPP. Well, how do you, what's the high level math on it? So the amount of the loan that a company is eligible for is tied heavily to their historical spending on payroll. And it's important, this is payroll, not for employees, not so much for independent contractors. We can talk about independent contractors in a moment. But essentially, you look at your last 12 months average payroll costs. So average payroll costs over the last 12 months, approximately you multiply that by 2.5, and that is the maximum loan amount that a company can borrow under this program. And in particular, what makes 7A very powerful here is there's a strong loan forgiveness program built into it, where as long as you receive these funds and largely maintain your employee headcount and payroll spend for an 8-week period after receiving funds, you can get an amount equal to spend on payroll, rent, mortgage interest, and utilities forgiven. And we've been modeling out some calculations for a number of clients, and most companies, the way the math will work is they'll the loan amount will roughly equal what they can get forgiven, so long as they maintain headcount and payroll spend across that 8-week period.
Right. So we'll go in, and I want to go in a little bit deeper into this payroll protection program, which you'll hear us call PPP or 7A. So I think the most important thing you said is not the government's basically saying, here's money. And if you spend the money in specific ways by keeping your payroll at a certain level, we'll actually give you the money for free. You got to keep it. It's a grant. And if you don't, it's still low interest. And I believe it's still long term. What is the terms of those loans? And what is the interest rate? Is it 1%?
Yeah, the interest rate's 1%. I believe the term is 10 years. And when you see me look down, I actually have a cheat sheet here that I have to consult. But it's the terms of the loan aren't really what is as attractive. It's that forgiveness provision, and that's where everyone's focusing. The forgiveness provision is really what we call the permanent benefit behind it. That is the ultimate cash value of the program. Right. But yes, if you did want to use the funds more as just a form of traditional financing, it's some fairly cheap capital.
Right. So a couple things that I think are important to kind of pull out. So the first thing is that what's great about this loan is it's basically the government saying, hey, we want to incentivize you to keep people employed. It almost doesn't matter what they do. It's basically saying that if you're keeping them on your books, we want to help you do that. And if all you do is do that, then there's an opportunity for you to there's an opportunity for that to be forgiven. So it effectively works like a grant, where the government's basically giving you a grant to cover that period. And
yes.
so even if you don't have it all forgiven, it's still a 10-year loan at 1% interest, which would be hard to beat in almost any other circumstance, without requiring a personal guarantee or any kind of collateral against it, I believe, correct?
Correct.
Right.
Not only that, there's an automatic 6 months deferral on principal and interest, and there's no prepayment penalty. So let's say a company borrowed $100,000, they were only eligible to get $80,000 forgiven. If they otherwise would rather pay the remaining principal back, they can pay that back early with no form of prepayment penalty.
Great. So perfect. So that's the PPP loan. Now, a couple of things I think would be relevant to this audience. And what I love is happening now is people are asking some questions, which is great. Again, you can raise your hands and we'll get to questions about 6 or 7 minutes. So one is a question of calculation. So the size of the loan is based on a formula, right?
Yes.
Around your payroll, around your rent, around everything else. What happens when a lot of organizations, in our case, where they're hiring a lot of coaches or other organizations, people that may be part-time, if you have a lot of 1099s, how does that influence your calculation if that's the structure of your business?
So here's the best way to think about 1099s. Unfortunately, if you have a workforce that is heavy on utilizing team members who are paid as independent contractors, the funds are not necessarily going to be directed towards the employers. They'll actually be directed towards the independent contractors. So an independent contractor can apply for a PPP loan just like an actual traditional business. They're limited to their average monthly income, no more than on $100,000 annualized. So you'd have to kind of almost calculate your loan amount as if you're an employee, but the funds would essentially go to the independent contractors as opposed to the companies itself. Otherwise, and kind of the policy logic behind it, this is something that took a little while to unpack because the statute was unclear. Otherwise, it's viewed as a double dip. So if the employer or if the main company took the benefit based upon the independent contractor, and then the independent contractor turned around and took it on their own company, it's essentially $2 going. It's again kind of a double dip behind it.
Right.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jerry.
So I think here's what's really important then to translate for this audience. The first is if you have a structure, you're for-profit or nonprofit, which both are eligible, in which you have full-time employees or part-time employees, but that are people that are not 1099s, that you're in a position to get. You'll be able to get in mortgage, pay mortgage, some of their mortgage-related interest, and your utilities and your rent, which may be high again for some of you sports organizations. That there's an ability to apply to get that money, and that will dictate the size of the loan. If a lot of your workforce is 1099s, then what you can actually do is go to your coaches and say, "Hey, I'm going to help you apply for this loan so that you have income. So even if I can't give you the money, I'm helping you stay afloat, and that's a way that I'm supporting you. That's differentiating my organization, right?" And you might be able to say that, "Hey, I've talked to this one bank. They're ready to go." And so you can actually assist your organizations, your 1099s, if you can't get the money for them, to actually help make sure they're staying afloat, because that's a good way of keeping them being able to pay the bills who you care deeply about, so that they're ready to go as you need them to go. The other thing I want to encourage everyone as we're in today's conversation is if you feel like there are things that this law missed about you guys, like maybe we could say, hey, if businesses that are structured more 1099s, it's so hard to get these guys to do it on their own. Maybe the bill should be amended to do this differently. There will be opportunities for a fourth, fifth, and sixth stimulus. It's a leadership role that LeaguApps is eager to play, and we're eager to get Tom's counsel on this. So if there are places that don't seem to apply, please surface that in this conversation or afterwards, because I'm eager to help us advocate to make sure that this industry is properly represented and spoken to for the stuff that's out there. So that's just an aside. So we've talked a lot about the 7A loans. We've talked about how that'll work. And then there's the forgiveness calculation afterwards, which I'm sure as we get into the discussions with folks, we can. Before we jump into other questions, there's also another component. So what are the EIDL loans? What does that look like in the $10,000 events? Can you explain what these emergency economic injury grants are, and what are the other kind of loan that people might be able to go access?
Right. So the EIDL, basically the economic injury loans / grants. This is a little bit more of a traditional SBA lending facility. So it works a lot more like a more traditional loan. There's no forgiveness component too, with one caveat that we can get into later. One of the kind of neat features about the economic injury program is there's essentially a $10,000 advance that's given to any and all applicants, and that advance does not need to be repaid, and you receive it even if you don't ultimately get approved for a loan. So without sounding crass, it's almost a free $10,000 for everyone who applies. Now you can actually take and you can receive an economic injury loan and a 7A loan as well. The economic injury loan can be rolled in to your 7A loan, which might give a little bit more favorable terms on deferral and payment. But you cannot use the dollars from both programs for the same purpose, which makes it a little bit difficult to navigate the two.
Right. But let's say, so just to be clear, if I want the 7B loan or the EIDL loan, right? You might hear that 7B. That's
Yes.
an SBA loan. My understanding, the question is, what's the purpose of that loan? And the purpose has to be distinct than the purpose that you would use your 7A loan. So
Yeah.
One thing is that if the 7A loan isn't that large for you because of this question of 1099s, the 7B loan may be a better alternative. One of the things I'll say is if you apply for a 7B loan and you apply for less than $200,000, two things will happen. One, there is no personal guarantee required if that's the situation that you're thinking about. The second thing is that you can get this $10,000 advance, I believe, within 3 days of the application. So everyone listening here, there's literally a way to get $10,000 right away if you go that route. But one of the things I understand is it can't be both connected to the same injury. So it can be very difficult to try to do both loan programs. And as I understand it, it's not just a question of purpose. It may also be a question of what you're responding to. So for example, if your facility had a flood, right? You had a flood or there was a weather damage, and you have the coronavirus that's shutting down your business, you could apply for the 7A and the 7B or the EIDL for 7B. You could apply for both of those things. And up to $200,000 is not a personal guarantee, and you could get a $10,000 advance. If both of the injuries are connected to coronavirus, am I right, Tom, that may prevent you from actually getting and drawing from both of those pools?
Yes, and that's not directly in the law. That's just kind of in the mechanics of the underlying programs, and that's also touched off a lot of confusion amongst both practitioners and business owners themselves. Yeah. I mean, I literally so there's been several summaries published on the interplay between 7A and 7B, these two programs, and I think it was Tuesday. Literally within 5 minutes of each other, I received emails from law firms, one arguing one way, one arguing another way. Right. So that's kind of the nature of this, of what we're dealing with in these days is these programs. And it's interesting, they're actually not new programs. They are massive modifications of existing programs. And very, very few people specialized in either one of these. So, certainly everything that I know, and Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm guessing a lot of what you know about this, we've gathered this in the last, 10 days or so. So it's, we've had to become experts on the fly to the extent that one can here.
The only difference is people pay you for your expertise. So,
sometimes.
Yeah,
but we are
Sometimes.
advising people to stretch out payables. So
There you go. Yeah, and Tom's been an amazing resource, and he's being for the youth sports industry. So you've got the 7A, you got the 7B loan. Both of those are different options. Again, you can go well above. I think you can go to $2 million. Am I right on the EIDL? What's the maximum for the loan for the 7B?
7B, the maximum is actually $10 million.
Wow. So you can go to 10 million, and then that's going to be a really long-term loan. I think the interest rate is set at 3.75% for for-profits.
Yes.
And then is there a nonprofit rate that's a little bit lower than that?
That I'm actually not sure of.
Okay.
I've been mostly focused on the for-profit side. I should have probably done a little bit more homework on the nonprofit side, but I do believe there are different tiers for it, and we can get an answer on that pretty quick.
Great. So you've got, and again, afterwards, Tom and I will collect these questions. We can follow up. So we've talked about 7A, 7B. The last thing I'll say before we open it up is there are actually a couple other things that for some reason those programs aren't relevant for you. And that is there's an employee retention payroll tax credit. There's this notion of payroll tax delay. So what are those features? And I understand that those are exclusive if you're going for the payroll protection stuff, right?
Correct.
What are those things, and how could those actually help organizations out as an alternative?
Sure. So if a business does not receive funding under 7A, or the Paycheck Protection Program, there are some, let's call them payroll tax incentives that are available. So way to think of payroll taxes is not all companies end up paying U.S. federal income tax, but every company that has U.S. employees pays payroll taxes. Employers pay 6.2% for Social Security and I believe 1.3% for Medicare, Medicaid, up to a certain limit, and then employees pay the same with a little bit of an override or additional Medicare for more highly compensated individuals. What you can do if you're not receiving funding under PPP is you can defer payroll taxes for basically up to 2 years. So the payroll taxes that you would pay in calendar year 2020 are now due at 50% of it is due on December 31st, 2021, and 50% is due December 31st, 2022, which is an unprecedented incentive program that's offered. For the most part, and that's a deferral, so you still would owe the payroll taxes, but you could at least keep the cash in the bank and potentially use it to help keep the business going during this time. Now, on top of that deferral, there's also a special tax credit that companies can earn for employee retention. And the way this tax credit works is it's applied against payroll taxes. So you don't have to wait to file a federal income tax return and then use it to offset your federal income tax to the extent that you even have any, which a lot of companies are gonna have losses this year thanks to coronavirus. But you actually apply these credits against your payroll taxes, which are paid more frequently and more people pay them. And not only that, these credits are refundable, meaning if I have $100,000 in payroll taxes for a given quarter and I have $120,000 in credits, not only do I not pay the $100,000 in tax, I get a $20,000 check back as a result. So this is cash. This is near-term liquidity. On top of that, there is a program where Treasury and IRS will advance these credits to companies that are concerned about not being able to meet their payroll in the near term. There's some of the details of this program were released just this week. We're just now starting to kind of get into it with anticipation that it will go live next week, and companies will be able to tap into that program if they need to. So it's a good pivot if you're unable to obtain a 7A loan, but you still need capital to keep your payroll and other operations going.
Great. So let me just summarize. Then we're going to go to questions. There's a lot of them coming in, which is awesome to see. So the first thing I'll say is that there's the 7A loan, the payroll protection loan that you have that's forgivable, that's attractive with interest rate.
Yes.
And the issue there is got to be, one, you've got to figure out how much you're eligible for. That's depending
Correct.
on the structure of your payroll. Two is it constrains your ability to make personnel decisions, because the more decisions you make, whether I think it's a drop of your salaries below 25% and taking threshold of your employees below a certain threshold percent based on a formula, then you're less eligible for that forgiveness, right? So your hands are tied, but in a good way, because you're keeping people employed. That is the 7A pathway. In addition to the 7A pathway, you have the 7B or the EIDL pathway. If there's a different purpose of that loan, or at least you're going to use it a little bit differently, you can conceivably get both. And below 200,000, there is no personal guarantee on that. You can go up to $10 million on it. But you'd have to really figure out if you can go for both programs. If you go the 7A route, there's not much else you can really take advantage of in terms of some of these other programs. If you don't, the employee tax credit, the payroll and security tax delay, those are all available to you as an organization to be able to get some kind of savings and relief in terms of the taxation that you may have already collected or that you would collect in terms of the payroll tax and Social Security and whatnot. So that's kind of the landscape. And then there's some other little things around net operating losses and if you have an existing SBA loan, debt relief, which if there are questions about, we can get into. But I'm going to go to the questions now. So a reminder, there's two different ways to ask questions here. One is to answer and type it in the Q&A button. The second is to hit raise your hand, in which we'll mix the kind of people together and we'll go to you live. So the first question comes from Ryan Ward. I'm going to read the question so everyone can see it and pose it to Tom. And then I'm going to click a button called Answer Live, and I have literally no idea what will happen when I do that. In my head, Ryan's going to show up on the screen, and I know my team is going to tell me, why are you going to click this button? But I'm curious to see what happens. So what Ryan wants to know, and 6 other people want to know, if they got a PPP loan sometime this month, they hired everybody back that they may have let go, but they can't actually reopen in 8 weeks. Can they lay everyone back off and still be forgiven without penalty? Because they don't know when they're going to be reopened. So again, if they rehire and they pay them, but it gets forgiven, but they can't generate revenue, can they take that kind of action? And before I click the button to see if it's actually apparently it marks it live and Ryan does not come up on the screen. So sorry, Ryan, but what do you say for that? So if you take the loan, but you don't open in 8 weeks and you have to take action, then what happens?
So Ryan's premise is generally correct. So if you did have to furlough or lay off employees, really any employee furloughed or laid off after, I believe it's February 15th, if you rehire them to coincide with when you receive the loan, if you rehire them at the same pay rate and then maintain that for 8 weeks, you can get full loan forgiveness. After those 8 weeks, if you need to restructure things, the way the law is written right now, you can. And literally the intent behind that is, as we had mentioned earlier, the federal government is trying to give small companies an 8-week lifeline with the hope that after 8 weeks, we can maybe resuscitate the economy. Yeah,
here's my interpretation, Ryan. My read on this from the sources I had in Washington, you guys heard Izzy Klein last week, who's also been super supportive of us, the lobbyist, is that if 2 things are going to happen, especially in the context of youth sports. If you hire someone back and as soon as you get the loan, there's a clock for 8 weeks. If you keep them employed for that 8 weeks, meeting that payroll threshold, which I believe gives you some flexibility within 75, you have to maintain at least 75% of their compensation. I think that's right. But if their salary is below 100,000, if they're being paid more than 100,000, they're one of the best compensated people in youth sports that I know. But if they're more than $100,000, you can actually reduce them down because the government doesn't look at anything above 100,000. But if you bring them back for that 8-week clock, and as long as they're on your payroll, you're eligible for forgiveness, whatever happens after that 8-week period, because you did your job. The government incentivized you to keep them on your payroll. And if you can't get them to work, you can't get them to work. The other thing I've been told is that the government basically is seeing the demand for this program, which I think will be immense, and how effective it's going to be. Because if for some reason the government, if your business isn't open in 8 weeks and people are not allowed outside to play sports, that says a larger comment about what's happening in the economy. And so what I understand is that the government is anticipating additional stimulus programs, where what they would do is then come back and say, we'll give you another 8 weeks. And if you're already in the SBA loan system, you already have that relationship, I imagine you'll be advantaged or have the opportunity to create that kind of extension. Because the last thing the government wants is a bunch of people to be unemployed in 8 weeks, right after you take the loan either. So, and I think given how tied youth sports is to kind of what's going on, I feel like that, again, if you take this action, you can't open up in 8 weeks and you're forced to make those difficult decisions, the hope would be the government programs would be there. If not, you gave 8 more weeks of pay to your team in the hopes of having it and leveraging their productivity over the next 8 weeks to make you a better organization and to impact your communities. So thank you, Ryan, for that question. the next question I'll go to, and then I'll see if there's a raise your hand question we want to go to. It comes from Chris, which is, if they have 47 W-2 employees, but if pay is staggered based on the, I guess because some of them are high school ages, I think, and Chris can feel free to clarify here as well. I think that's what HS means. So basically the 12-month average for them and what they pay is lower because the 4-month season that they're currently in. So I think, as I understand what Chris is saying, and maybe Jamie, we can unmute Chris, is that their business is seasonal. So if you look at the formula and there's a seasonal calculation, what's the best way to get the maximum amount of PPP based on the seasonal business? Jamie, can we unmute Chris so he can clarify if I got that right? Chris.
Yes, Chris is allowed to talk.
Yeah, Jeremy, that's exactly right. We have all 47 work basically February, March, April, and May, where in other months we have quite a few less coaches working. So if we're talking about this season, it's about a $20,000 difference between a 12-month average.
So Tom, what's your approach to that? Thank you, Chris. How do you deal with the seasonal calculation? And one thing I'll say, Chris, is if we can't answer in the way we want to now, we'll commit to getting back to you with an answer, within the next day or two. But Tom, what's your approach to the seasonal calculation? How does that work?
I'm literally consulting my cheat sheet right now. While I'm finding an answer, one thing I will say is with these calculations, you are allowed some flexibility in terms of particularly for seasonal employers. You've got an alternative calculation you can run. You can also look at the traditional calculation in terms of what gives you the best answer. Also, I would not be surprised if banks end up allowing companies just to use calendar year 2019 payroll to run their averages as opposed to a last 12 months calculation. As a matter of fact, the initial draft application that the SBA produced, that's what they implied in their instructions. So potentially there's 3 different alternating methods that could be used to figure out what gives you the best answer here.
Cool. I think the other thing, I think the important thing to say, Chris, is, and the advice I would give everyone out here is, you'll do the calculations, and again, we can provide some additional guidance. We can, and as Tom kind of pulls this up, he will. One of the things that we've been kind of advised is you look at the different formulas of what that calculation looks like. You make the application. One of the things you can consider is whether these other programs, the 7B or the tax credit, might be better for you or as an alternative, and you got to do that kind of math. The other kind of consideration here as part of that is, what I've been told is that the government does not want fraud here, and so that there's a real likelihood that they're going to look into these things after the fact, and they can do that for a while. So we've taken the most conservative approach we can in terms of the interpretations, with the belief that there is going to be some scrutiny from the government on this, because that's the intent, to make sure this is used right. And so when you're looking at these and making these calculations, you really want to make sure you're making the calculations right. And when in doubt, our encouragement is that you want to make sure you want to be appropriate to be following the rules, but also be conservative. Because if you're not doing that, you can actually put yourself at risk. And there's an attestation or certification requirement as part of that. That's probably one of the most significant components of this, where you're basically certifying the loss and impact that you have. So, as we look for that calculation, we'll provide that to happen. So, Tom, anything else you want to say on this?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
I tell you what, I'm going to keep looking for it though. If we can go to the next question, and
Great.
I can jump back in as soon as I have it. So
Cool.
Fortunately,
So
I can walk and chew gum at the same time, which is somewhat unusual for folks from Louisiana like myself.
Yeah. So this is the scenario here, which is you're a 501c3 organization, and which I believe is eligible for these things. You pay your coaches and staff as 1099s, but they're only paying their coaches for 6 months because they pay them in the 6 months that they're really active as an organization. Are they even eligible? They also have rent and utilities as well. And there's a bunch of folks that have that situation. So again, a 501c3 organization, their staff, if not all of their staff, are 1099s. Those 1099s are around for 6 months. They're also paying presumably year-round rent and utilities. So how would you advise them to navigate that in terms of what that means for eligibility?
Right. Well, the big thing is I would lean hard on the independent contractors to go tap into these funds. The independent contractors, imagine a lot of these folks are just solo practitioners, for lack of a better term. Maybe you don't have they just deliver their own services and don't have employees of their own. But to the extent a sole proprietorship does have their own employees or their own labor costs, they can put that towards their own calculation. So it's potentially a little bit more substantial. in terms of what may be available. And that, of course, also goes for Jeremy, some of your clients who they themselves may be organized as a sole proprietorship. I know it's not as sole proprietorships aren't as common as they used to be because of legal liability reasons, but potentially I wouldn't exclude. You're almost advantaged if you are a sole proprietorship in that manner. In terms, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I guess to me then, if the calculation there is one, you've got a bunch of 1099s. The best thing to do is say you should take advantage of the government program. And again, the question is how can you help them? Maybe you identify a preferred SBA bank that's ready to receive and work with them. Maybe you're helping them interpret these things so your coaches feel really so supported. And in addition to this, there are now these other programs that you could take advantage of. So you could still apply for a PPP to cover your rent and utilities. You could decide that the tax credits, are they paying payroll taxes and things like that on the 1099s or no?
No, they're not paying payroll taxes on 1099s.
So the best for them, if they have these rent and utilities that they want covered, they could still apply for the PPP for any full-time employees and that rent and utilities as an option. They could also go the 7B route or the EIDL, get $10,000 immediately and apply for that loan. And again, up to $200,000, there's no personal guarantee. And so in this case, when you don't have a lot of 1099s or full-time employees and you're really trying to cover rent and utilities, then you're probably paying a little higher interest rate on the 7B, but you can get immediate access to cash. You know, there's just the question of you're not going to get that forgiven, but you can probably take a higher ceiling if you had a broader use of things beyond rent and utilities that you might want to pay for. Is that a fair read on it? Yes,
that's correct. Another area where you could really help your 1099 workforce be ready is there's going to be a set of documentation that the independent contractors and sole proprietors will need to have ready to bring to a bank to file an application. Biggest thing is going to be their Form 1099 MISCs, as well as likely some type of they're likely going to have to produce some type of certificate showing if they're particularly a sole proprietorship, when they were in business and what have you. So even just having kind of like having those at the ready to where they can access them really quick, bring to their bank so that they can get the funds. That's going to be key, because this one thing we haven't touched on, Jeremy, is all indications is that the 7A funds are going to be, so the PPP funds are going to be doled out on a first come, first served basis. So speed is of value on this. And
we'll get back to that in a second about tips about applying. I think the person who asked the question, I think she's live now. So do you want to have a follow-up question, or did we answer it?
I'm like, well,
hi.
So there's no way to go in with a 1099 and do the application for them and pay them through? I guess is kind of what I was wondering. If they didn't apply, I mean, they need to apply.
Correct. There's no, there is a means where a third party could be an agent for an applicant, but one of the concerns that we have is that the banks aren't necessarily going to be eager to work with agents in these regards, because it impacts how the banks are ultimately compensated for originating these loans. Okay. So short answer, no.
There were two other clubs.
Long answer, maybe, but it would be difficult.
Okay. There were two other clubs who had gotten with their attorneys here in our state, and then one in Texas, and they both were like, "Oh yeah, 1099, you can apply." And that's what I thought I read that you couldn't. So that's what I want a clarification on.
Yeah, but I think here's a thought or perspective, just off the cuff recommendation, which is if you got 1099s, a lot of your employees, and they're people that are obviously important in your organization, if you can have the expertise to help support how they're filling it out, give them the information, give them the guidance, maybe even direct them to the right SBA lender, those can be all ways that they can take advantage of the program. And the one thing to Tom's point, speed is of the essence here. So if they're going to be slow to figure it out, and it's hard enough to probably get them to help you collect invoices or whatever else you're using if you're not using LeaguApps, what are the ways that you can go about doing that? The other thing is that if you're in the business of recruiting coaches, go ahead and be a resource to coaches in your community. Go ahead and say, hey, we're going to have a Zoom webinar. We're going to have a local accountant come on, and we're going to help answer your questions to be helpful. And it's a great way to build a relationship with coaches that maybe you don't even work with now, to make sure that you're helping support this entire community out there that, again, can create some goodwill that may create some opportunities for you down the road. So just a thought. Thank you very much.
Yeah, can I ask one more? On when they go in for the 1099 and they have the 1099 miscellaneous, do they need to take like our, I guess, contract that says we were paying them for a certain amount of time? Is that what you're talking by certificate?
No, the 1099 MISC should be enough. I actually have the, there is a specific section of the statute that deals with the documentation that an independent contractor or sole proprietor has to produce. And let me see if I can just kind of summarize it really quickly, just so I can be brief but precise here. An eligible self-employed individual, independent contractor, or sole proprietor shall submit such documentation as is necessary to establish such individual as eligible, including payroll tax filings reported to the Internal Revenue Service, Forms 1099 MISC, and income and expenses from the sole proprietorship as determined by the administrator and secretary. Most likely, it's just going to be the 1099s, and beyond that, I mean, maybe a tax return for 2019 if it's available. And Jeremy, I'd be curious to get your thoughts here as well. The general idea and all of the communication from Washington is they want to get this money out fast to small businesses, and they'd rather the banks not tick and tie every single thing. I mean, obviously, they're concerned about fraud, the banks in particular, but just like how we're trying to get applications in fast to the SBA and Treasury want to get the money back out even quicker. That's the representations that Secretary Mnuchin and others have been making. So
so they want to get this money in your hands, and so this is where this is the important point. They're going to trust the applications that are coming in. They're not going to ask as many questions. They're looking to get speed, but they're going to look up after the fact. And so if you're not buttoned up, or people aren't doing it the right way, or they're trying to take advantage of it, there's not going to be a lot of tolerance. And the thing I would suggest is, depending on what happens with the election in the fall and all these other things, may very well change who's focusing on this and how they're approaching this as well. And so that is really important, because they can investigate and look into this after the fact. So that goes back to making sure that if you have the information, if it's accurate, submit it. But when there's interpretations, you want to make sure you're pretty buttoned up. And our approach and our general advice we've been given has been to be as conservative as possible in there. Thank you very much for the question. I'll go to a next question, and then we'll come back to any other live questions. If a 1099 coach applies for the PPP, do they have the opportunity for it to be forgiven as well? And if they don't have a separate company as independent contractors and they don't pay themselves a salary, can they still apply for a PPP?
Yes. So no, yes to both questions. So the PPP can be forgiven for an independent contractor or sole proprietor, and the sole proprietor essentially can take their sole proprietorship income as a wage for purposes of the calculation. And it's a little bit tricky in terms of how that works, because the sole proprietor essentially has to annualize their compensation over the 12-month period to determine whether or not they don't run afoul of a $100,000 limit. So the idea is that you can't really use any wages that are in excess of $100,000 for the purposes of this calculation. And that goes both for businesses and then also for the independent contractors. So an independent contractor would have to run this calculation. Obviously, if an independent contractor on an annual basis doesn't earn income in excess of $100,000, it's not an issue. Really, they're just going to take their 1099 to show what they made in the year, and then they can get a loan amount based upon that 12-month average.
Great.
And I believe the seasonal rules also do apply for the independent contractors. I'm trying to work the handy dandy cheat sheet. As you can see, it's been marked up and bled all over here. But those rules, most of what applies to a company will also apply to an independent contractor.
Nicholas, I think if I'm right, you have a question. So if you want to jump in here, and if you have a video camera, feel free to show it. Just tell us real quick what organization, what city you're coming from, and if you like LSU, you might get a better answer. Nicholas, we have you. Nicholas, we can't hear you. So
you hear me now?
There you go. Yeah, we got you. And I'm told, actually, I guess we have to, I think there's some Zoom protections about video based on some Zoom bombing that's happening these days.
Oh, boy.
So Nicholas, tell us where you're at, what organization you're with, and what's your question.
All right, so I'm in New York, Westchester County. I'm with Primetime Lacrosse. I did root for LSU, so I hope they get some good advice here. Thank you so much for guys. I just want to say, a lot of small business owners, we really appreciate your time. I know it's a lot of effort, so thank you guys for LeaguApps as well.
Thanks.
But I had two questions based on what I'm hearing. So I'm in the process of filing for the $10,000 relief loan, but it says ask for business activity. How would you define youth sports as a business activity from that perspective?
Yeah,
I
don't. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jeremy.
I was gonna say it seems like I would just describe it as that you're an event business, right? Like that you're an event business, and that's what I would describe yourself as, because people understand the disruption in the event businesses, and that's one of the intent here. So if the question is the best way to describe your what you do, I would describe it as youth sports events programs and business, right? Effectively, does that sound right to you?
And Jeremy, you would know this better than me. Is there an NAICS or business activity code that's more specific to youth sports? And if there is,
Yeah.
I would use language identical to whatever the description is under that code, because that's probably, even if they're asking for more of a textual description of the business, that's probably how they're going to be thinking of it in terms of, that's how the government always thinks of businesses is in terms of these activity codes.
So let's do this.
That's how I would do it.
I'll do this as my homework. I don't know if Rick is our VP of Finance is on the line. I don't think he is, because I think he's doing a lot of work on the SBA stuff.
Probably working on the application.
But the one thing I'll say is that so I will get back about what the NICS code is, and we will post that to. We'll send out an email to the group and LinkedIn and what our recommendations are. One of the things we've been talking about is the creation of the youth sports industry. So we'll figure out what the best way to describe that. If somebody here happens to know what NICS code is that they're using, feel free to add that into the chat. We'll take a look at that. Otherwise, I'll assign that as homework. I know Jenny on our team will take the lead in working with our finance department and making sure we're making that as a recommendation. Nicholas, does that answer your question?
It does. But the other question I had tied to this is, so you're saying you can either get 7A or 7B, but you can't get both. And if you can get both, because you have to be harmed in two different ways. Is that correct?
So what do you think, Tom? Because that was the initial interpretation. One thing, in fairness, this stuff is shifting quickly. Is it that you have to use the proceeds differently, or is it the harm that's differently?
It's my understanding is you have to use the proceeds differently, but there is still a decent amount of confusion on it. There's a little bit of clarification in, let me find it here. So just kind of my show and tell. So this is the 31-page guidance that came out last night from the SBA. This was the federal government's 7 p.m. Thursday gift to guys like me. Some nice bedtime reading. And I do believe there's a little bit more clarification in the overlap, but my first impression reading through it is that it doesn't completely resolve the issue. I think Jeremy's interpretation is more conservative, and that's the way I would go with it. But you definitely cannot use the proceeds for the same purpose. So begs the question, okay, if you get the 7A loan to cover payroll, rent, and utilities, and you also get 7B money, what are you going to use the 7B money for? Because it does have to be used for a specific purpose. So
Sorry, go ahead, Nicholas.
Just to clarify, also, you're saying like my organization, I have 75 independent contractors, and I'm the only employee on the books. So when I fill out these loan stuff, it should only be myself and capped to that $100,000 mark. Should I make that correct? That's correct.
Yes, that's correct.
Because when I spoke to my bank today, they were under the impression that you could put the independent contractors in there. The small bank.
No, and let me again. I know this is kind of nerdy, but let me read the exact language from the guidance that came out last night. Because
if people want to see the guidance, guys, we'll post the guidance. So real quick,
on this particular topic, the guidance was exactly on point. So, do independent contractors count as employees for purposes of PPP loan calculations? No. Independent contractors have the ability to apply for a PPP loan on their own, so they do not count for purposes of a borrower's PPP loan calculation. So that was one of the items that was, kind of made crystal clear last night.
Okay.
Right. And you're making the point, though, Nicholas, the reason why that's the case is the double dipping argument. It's
Yeah.
basically saying if you apply and they apply separately. So what I would say is if you have those 10, one is what you need to do the calculation and the math on is what's better. Are you better off doing a 7B loan where you, so am I right? I think the 7A loan, the limitation is the use of what you do. So it's rent and it's utilities and everything else. If you have a broader use of what those things might be, I believe there's going to be more flexibility. Tom, you can correct me if I'm wrong on the EIDL. So that
Yes.
there, it's like, let's say, for example, you're like, I'd really want $200,000. It's not going to be forgiven, but I can get that at a low interest rate. I can get that payback over 10 years with no guarantee. You might have more flexibility in the use of those proceeds than you would on the, and then the $10,000 immediate advance than you might have if you were applying for the 7A, in which if it's just you and then your rent and utilities, that may not be as threshold. So you got to do those kinds of calculations and then make that kind of calculation and determination. Makes sense?
A lot of my coaches are like 1099 employees, but they're also like teachers and have other jobs. So were they able to apply as well? You know, those, so because were that considered, you know, double, because they have two different jobs, they may be applying for unemployment because they've lost their job and now they lost this. Like, you know, I'm sorry to ask a million questions. I'm just curious.
No
worries.
So my understanding, Nicholas, is the fact that they're, you know, they have a, let's just use the term, a day job, would not bar them from filing for PPP under this, under the law as it's written right now and all of the guidance.
Right.
So,
Thank
like
you.
if I were in their position, I would go for the PPP money as well.
So let's go, Nicholas. I'm going to go on to the next question, but thank you very much. One thing I'll say, by the way, that we haven't talked about is what are there stuff that's available at the state and local level. So, for example, if you're in the New York City area, New York City has a program. I think it's a $75,000 loan. I don't know what they've designed New York City to also include anything in the outside areas like the Westchester County. But there's I know Goldman Sachs has a program that we're looking into that has a $250 million set aside that they're doing. And I believe that what New York City is doing is it's basically a $75,000 loan. It's very, very low to no interest that you can get. In Chicago, I think is the other area that is using the Goldman Sachs funds as well. So if any organizations are in the Chicago area, whatever else, I would take a look at that. If I can ask Jenny on our team to post in the chat tool or give it to Jamie, the link to that, to the information on the Goldman Sachs program, that may not be a bad thing to share with the group as well. I also want to point out in the chat tool, thank you, Donna and Carolyn. I feel like I'm a radio show host here. You're suggesting that that SIC code is being the 713990. We'll go back and study that and see if we have any other alternative recommendations. I'm going to direct everybody into the Q&A panel. So keep looking if there's questions in there that you think are really excited to be answered as we're running up on time in a few minutes. Just upvote that so I know, and we'll start by going with Steve Sack. Steve Sack is asking, who runs a great organization up in Michigan. Hey, Steve, what documentation besides their 1099-C will the independent contractors need to provide when they apply for the PPP program? I think what we answered that already is you don't have to provide anything other than the 1099 form, as well as presumably maybe a last year's tax return if you had it. The government's job is to get this in your hands pretty quickly. So the documentation requirements are pretty light, correct?
Yes. When it comes to documentation, ultimately it's going to be up to the banks. And this is my opinion. This isn't anything I've read, but I think the government's leaning fairly hard on the banks to take it easy, particularly on smaller applicants. Don't ask the smaller applicants to come in with a mountain of paperwork to get this money.
So the next question, Jeff asks a question, and I think this is important, that we bank with a credit union. They're not taking part in PPP. I'm told all the big banks will require current business accounts to take account. Any other way to take place in PPP? So let me start by answering my perspective here and what I think is really important for people to understand. Our belief is, just anecdotally, there's going to be a tremendous amount of demand for this $360 billion. And the government is prepared to put more money into this program, is my understanding from Washington, if they can show that kind of demand, right? The other practicality, though, is if you don't apply now and you don't get it now, what does that wait look like? Especially if right now Congress is recessed, I think it's to the 22nd or 23rd of April. So the first thing is you got to get your application in right away. Like, you got to get on top of this. You got to get in right away. I'd be ready to go on Monday and make this happen. Right now, we of the 5 banks that we're tracking, I don't think any of them that we understand, although that may have changed in the call, have actually opened the application because there's so much uncertainty. I know Bank of America is taking pre-applications. The second thing is that most banks will require you to have an account. Like bigger banks will require you to have an account with them. So one thing you can do is open up an account with them. And one of the things that we've seen is literally pick a couple of banks that might be, it's a Chase or Bank of America or a bigger bank. Maybe it's a smaller community bank. You could open up 2 different accounts with them, so that you're both of them, and whichever one you feel like is going to treat you better is open with the applications first. You go with it, because again, you want to be at the front of the line here. You want to be ready to go, and put yourself in position to be successful. And so, so our advice to you is be communicating with multiple different banks. If you don't have an existing banking relationship, reach out and say that you're willing to put a little bit of money in that account if you're able to do that, and that may be a way to have that relationship. The other thing is to consider, especially in your case, are you better off being a big fish in a smaller pond, so to speak, with like one of the local community banks that may be in a better position to deal with you? If people are struggling to have access to the right kind of banks, if I can ask you to go ahead and message LeaguApps, and you could do that, post that out, send that message in to the email that we send inviting you, or to your LeaguApps representative. If we understand that you're looking for banking relationships, one thing we could try to do is identify some preferred SBA banks to kind of direct you to. Now, it's a little bit crazy today for them, but I do imagine, over the next week that we could start to directing you to some banks if that is an issue for the community out there. Liz has a question. If a club applies for the PPP loan for 1099 employees, is that different than applying for a loan as an organization? So what they're basically saying is, are you saying that this loan can be used to supplement a loss of income for 1099 employees? And if I understand the question, and then maybe Tom, you can confirm that. I think what the question is if the club themselves cannot make the loan, cannot get a payroll loan for your 1099 employees. Then what the government's basically saying is the 1099 employee themselves has to go get the loan.
Yes.
I would recommend you all to take a lead effort to make that happen, to facilitate that, to support that, not necessarily becoming an agent for the reasons that Tom made that may be more challenging and may have involved more regulation, but at least trying to facilitate and be that thought leader and support system for them to do that. And then whatever the harm is to the organization, whether it's full-time employees, rent, utilities, or otherwise, consider how that debt instrument might impact you as well. So those things can happen simultaneously. The 1099 supporting them doing it directly, and then you doing it for the needs that you have. Tom, is that a fair way of kind of describing that?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And one other just brief point, Jeremy, for companies to be careful of is, my understanding is some of the banks are saying we're only working with companies that are account holder, or with companies that are account holders and have been an account holder since February 15th or something like that. So there's some that say like, yeah, you got to open an account and then you can apply. There's others who says, no, you have to have a little bit more history with us. So just to, and I think it's very, I think Chase is in the former category, is in the latter category there.
Yeah. That's a great point. And I think the other thing I'd say, then, if you have an existing banking relationship and you're really close with them, and yet they're not participating in the 7A program, then what you should do is say, hey, we want to still bank with you, but you got to make an introduction. You got to get us in front of another bank so we're getting attention, because you don't have that relationship. The other thing I would encourage you to do is, if you have parents, or if you're running an adult league and adults in your league that I would go to them and say, hey guys, we have ways we want to make sure our coaches and our employees are getting paid and support. The government has a program out there. Do you all have any connections to any of these banks? And if you go on the SBA, go on the SBA website, and one thing, if I can ask Jenny or Jamie, why don't you ask Rick if we can get a list? There's a link to the SBA lender link. If you go through that lender list, send it out to your organizations and say, hey, in my area, these are the 10 banks we're trying to get to. Does anyone have a connection? Or go on LinkedIn and see if anybody that you're connected to as parents in your organization have a connection. The personal relationship and introduction is going to be important, so you get closer to the front of the line where you can. Liz, any other follow-up? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, guys.
Great. We got a question from Clovelet, which I'm not exactly sure what the real name is, but hey, when applying for an EIDL, my understanding is that you'll get the $10,000 forgiven and you don't have to pay it back. Is that true? Also, for the EIDL, what am I allowed to spend the money on for the EIDL? So great question on the EIDL, which is also known as the 7B. What can they get if they get that $10,000 back within 3 days of employees? Is that something that's forgiven? And then also, what can they spend the EIDL for?
So the first part of the question, yes, it can be forgiven, or it's forgivable. The only thing to remember, though, is if someone receives both a EIDL, so a 7B, and a PPP, or a 7A, the amount forgiven under, or that $10,000 freebie, is actually carved out of the forgiveness amount of the PPP money so that you basically can't double dip on forgivable loans, if you will. In terms of what there is a good bit of overlap between what you can use EIDL money for and what you can use PPP money for. So PPP, you're basically limited to some very basic kind of payroll and operating expenses. EIDL is a little bit broader. They have a few areas I think that fall outside of it. I'm not 100% on each of the itemized areas, but if your concern is taking care of costs that are broader than just payroll, rent, utilities, and mortgage interest, EIDL would be a better way to go in that particular circumstance. But it's also important to remember that cash is fungible. And so one question I've been getting a lot from companies, and Jeremy probably heard this a little bit too in your network, is, look, I'm okay right now. Yes, I'm not operating. My office is closed, but I've got the provisions to weather the storm. And should I even really participate in this 7A program? Because isn't this really for companies in need? That's not necessarily the intention of the program itself. So even if you feel you're sufficiently capitalized for the next let's say 8 to 12 weeks, you can take the PPP money, use that for payroll, and then put the other capital you have to work in other ways. If you needed to do some capital improvements or hiring or other areas where you need to deploy capital, you can do that. It's not the best explanation I gave to a client earlier today is it's not like they're going to give you marked bills and they'll be checking it that way.
That's much appreciated, because that's really what I'm trying to get at. And Jeremy, my name is Chris Lovelet, which is the C Lovelet. I apologize. I just clicked enter, and it just abbreviated my name. I'm doing great, and thank you both. I sincerely appreciate all of your information. But that's kind of where we're at. And we have rentals coming up. We are looking to expand. That's where we are as a business. And obviously, we don't know how long all this is going to go on for. We have nationals hopefully coming up, but we really don't know. And so we have bills still that we have paid for already that we may not get the money back. So that was really the point of the question. And I sincerely appreciate your time.
Awesome. Let's rapid fire a couple last questions. I want to get through these, and then we'll let Tom go back to probably answering all kinds of other questions about these things. One of the questions has to do with repeating what we said about contractors meaning coaches. And so just to be clear, and I think this goes back to another question about the calculation for the payroll for the PPP. Does that only include W-2 employees? When we're saying 1099s, what do we mean if you're hiring a coach that's part-time? Tom, explain to me the different structures, what's calculated in and out, and maybe just kind of explain that distinction.
Right. So let's put it this way. So a corporate or like an institutional applicant. So imagine a lot of the participants on this call can only take W-2'd employees, be they full-time or part-time. Can only take those wages for the purposes of formulating the maximum loan amount calculation. Those applicants cannot take 1099 costs, the 1099 costs that they themselves paid into the calculation. Now, a sole proprietor or independent contractor who still has their business organized that way, who actually happens to have some wage costs, can take both their 1099 income as well as wage costs they themselves may have paid for the purposes of calculating this benefit. And that's where it gets kind of confusing. There was so much confusion on this, it really was not even clarified until about 7 or 8 p.m. Central Time last night. At least that's when I saw the guidance on it.
Great. So I think a couple last things. I think one thing I think we've already answered is if someone else has another source of income, they're 1099. If the government's trying to make that income whole. So if you got laid off from another job, you can collect your unemployment. If you had 1099 income, you also have the ability to apply for relief there. And those are separate things. And I think that was Rafe's question that he had. And then the other thing is that someone was asking a question about dealing with fees paid by parents where effectively lost their season. So in this case, if I guess what I would say is that if you collected revenue and then you have to pay back you have to give back refunds, and you have to pay that cash to give back refunds.
Yeah.
Or pay that cash to cover the whatever it may be. I think to your point about fungibility on cash, the PPP program is not going to help you, except for the fact that if you get money to cover payroll, you can turn around and take that money and then use that to fund the refunds if you need to. The alternative, though, is that ADA comes in, where you could then use those proceeds to be able to support refunds that you don't have the cash for right now, and maybe take some of the relief from the other programs.
That is correct. Yeah, EIDL has a broader scope to where you could deploy that capital for those purposes, to essentially make up for economic injury.
That's right. And the one thing I'll say is I'll direct you to if you go to the blog.leaguapps.com on the LeaguApps website, you'll see there's some good resource articles out there on guidance around dealing with payments disputes. There's one that we put up yesterday of a resource guide to that. If they've gotten to that stage, there's also a question of how you deal with refunds and credits. And I believe there's some really good templated tools that we've offered up. We provide for a lot of LeaguApps partners, and I think we made these public, which are basically templates and advice and guidance of how to be proactive. So instead of getting to the point where they're coming to you for refunds, what's the story you can tell them to help understand why you need to continue to pay coaches, why you need to continue to do these things to hold on to that revenue. So as we've covered a lot of ground here. The perspective I have is that, there are a lot of questions out there. What I'm interested in inviting this community on this call and the broader youth sports community and local sports community to do is, if you have continued questions here, or you're like, wow, this doesn't apply to me, this isn't helping me the way I need it, I wish it did X, Y, and Z, please make that known to us, because we are going back and are eager to launch a much more public advocacy program to support this. So stay tuned on that, because we want to advocate for the industry. The second thing is, if you're just confused, if you're trying to figure out how this thing is and you need some help, go ahead and let someone from LeaguApps know, and we'll continue to figure out how we marshal resources to support you in organizations, or even potentially connect this group to each other. I'll direct you to our Slack group, and I'll have Jamie go ahead and put that link up in our chat tool, or Jenny, that explains how to be part of it. Slack is a great technology tool. It's free to come in. It's a community. We've got a few hundred organizations that are in there. And then you can go in there and ask questions of each other, and then use each other as guides to even see how you're filling out the applications or the guidance that you're coming out with coaches. Maybe one good idea could be is coming up with a guidance for 1099s that you guys could kind of share and help those organizations out. And we want to continue the conversation. So let us know if we can be helpful to you in other ways. That's the position we take at LeaguApps is trying to do what we can to bring this community together. And together, remember what this is about, which is, the importance of youth and local sports is critical. It's going to be more critical than ever before. So how we're helping you make that happen. And there's ways that LeaguApps can be helping you directly during this time. We'd love to figure that out as well. Please join me in thanking Tom. You've been amazing as you in real time are trying to understand what's going on here.
Thank you.
Tigers. Again, you are the Joe Burrow of tax and law advice here. And Tom is someone who's trying to do his best to help small businesses and organizations at this time. Alvarez and Marcel is an amazing organization. So we appreciate you and representing your firm and your community so great. And then the other thing is just know that we're here for you and this entire community as well. If you've got questions, let us know. Hit up on the Slack group, and then we'll send out an email summary as a follow-up with a few of the links that we talked about. So with that, I'm going to let everyone go. Have an incredibly happy Friday. These aren't normal circumstances, but we're going to survive to thrive this. And hopefully today's session provided some tools for that. If you're interested in doing more of these things, again, give us that feedback because we're eager to continue to provide resources. I think if there are no questions that we answered appropriately, I'll look through the list of this stuff and provide that personally after the call. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend and stay safe, stay healthy, and let's bring sports back. Take care.
Thank you, Jeremy.